I never planned to challenge what I'd learned from history books. That only started after I really looked at the buildings. Vast glass domes stretching over acres. Terracotta palaces packed with carvings we couldn't reproduce today, even if we tried. Exhibition halls thrown together in a few months that would take us years now. This wasn't rough, early construction done with horse-drawn carts. It felt like something already there, something passed down. And then, almost on schedule, the disasters showed up. Fires that erased entire cities. Floods that buried first floors overnight, happening across different continents. Earthquakes striking with unsettling precision. Ask yourself this: what are the chances that nearly every major city holding these architectural anomalies was hit by catastrophe within the same narrow stretch of time? And every time it happened, the same chain reaction followed. Building methods disappeared. Blueprints went up in flames. Skilled craftsmen vanished without a trace. Population records became fractured. Census numbers stopped lining up. Orphan trains appeared, hauling hundreds of thousands of children who seemed to come from nowhere. Asylums filled to the brim with people labeled confused, while whole family lines were simply wiped from record. That's when I ran into the question that cracked everything open. If there really was a different world before ours, a civilization we're told never existed, where did all the people go? Forget the buildings for a moment. Forget the architecture. Where are the people, the witnesses, the survivors? Where did they disappear to? It started with photographs. Late 1800s street scenes from cities all over the globe. San Francisco, Melbourne, Moscow, Buenos Aires, Chicago. I was originally researching urban development when something odd kept repeating in image after image. Streets torn open. Buildings with their first floors half buried. Workers digging out entire city blocks. The captions brushed it off as grading projects or street elevation work. But the scale didn't fit. The frequency didn't fit. The timing definitely didn't fit. In San Francisco alone, from 1850 to 1915, the city appears to have excavated and regraded itself multiple times. Not small fixes, whole neighborhoods. And here's the part that still doesn't sit right. Nobody seemed bothered by it. No outrage from property owners. No public protests over the staggering cost. No clear records explaining where all that earth came from or where it was hauled away to. Just thousands of workers, day after day, moving absurd amounts of soil like it was the most ordinary task in the world. That leads to a simple but uncomfortable question. If some event, or a series of them, buried large portions of cities worldwide under mud and debris, where are the first-hand accounts? Where are the stories from the people who lived through it? The pattern keeps repeating with eerie consistency, across continents and across decades. I began digging through newspapers, city archives, historical societies. What I found wasn't a grand conspiracy of silence. It was something quieter and somehow worse. A consistent lack of explanation. Take Chicago after the fire of 1871. The city rebuilds at an incredible pace, throwing up hundreds of elaborate structures. Buildings that should have taken years using standard methods appear in under a decade. But when you go looking for detailed construction records, architectural drawings, or first-hand worker accounts, the trail goes thin. The paperwork is spotty, contradictory, almost like someone carefully noted that the buildings existed, but avoided recording how they were built, or who actually built them. Or look at the orphan trains in America, running from 1854 to 1929. We're told that around 250,000 children, maybe more, were shipped from eastern cities to families in the Midwest and West. The story says they were street kids, children of immigrants, victims of poverty. But the deeper I went into the numbers, the less they made sense. 250,000 children. That's not a charity effort. That's a demographic reset. And that's where the asylum records become impossible to ignore. Between 1840 and 1880, something remarkable happened in the United States alone. Hundreds of massive psychiatric institutions were constructed. These weren't small hospitals. They were enormous, palace-like buildings, often in the same ornate style seen at old world fairs and grand civic halls. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, Athens Lunatic Asylum, Buffalo State Asylum, Oregon State Hospital. The list goes on. Officially, this was framed as progress, a reform movement meant to treat mental illness with compassion and dignity. Satil, that explanation falls apart right here. The construction speed, the level of architectural detail, the staggering number of beds, all of it appears during a time we're told the country was barely out of its frontier phase. But the part that really unsettles me is this. Who exactly filled these places? The surviving records, where they exist at all, list tens of thousands of patients with eerily similar diagnoses: melancholia, acute mania, amnesia, confused thinking. Many have no documented life before admission. No family history, no place of origin. Often just a first name, sometimes a last, paired with a diagnosis that seems to smooth over a single theme: memory loss. So what if these weren't hospitals in the way we're told? What if they functioned as containment centers instead? Think it through. If some large-scale catastrophe shattered civilization, burying cities, uprooting populations, collapsing infrastructure, what would the aftermath look like? You'd expect survivors wandering around stunned and traumatized, people telling stories about a world that existed before, stories that didn't line up with the new version of reality being put together. Those stories wouldn't need to be erased outright. They'd need to be managed, redirected, medicalized. What's more effective than locking a witness away and labeling their memories as delusion? Mix real survivors in with patients who genuinely need help, and suddenly truth and madness blur into the same gray fog. The commitment records make this even harder to dismiss. People were institutionalized for reasons that sound almost surreal today: political excitement, excessive reading of novels, religious enthusiasm, nostalgia. That last one shows up again and again. Nostalgia. An unhealthy longing for the past. Or maybe a longing for a past that officially was never supposed to exist. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider following this channel for more deep dives into architectural mysteries and lost history. Adults, at least, could be contained. Managed through institutions, labels, and social pressure. Children were a different problem. Children talk. Children remember. Children ask questions adults either can't answer or don't want to. And that's where the orphan trains come in. Nearly 250,000 children removed from cities and scattered across rural America, raised far from their origins, absorbed into families who knew nothing about their past. Any strange memories could be dismissed as imagination, childish nonsense. What's striking is how vague the official records are about where these kids came from. Street children, homeless waifs, foundlings. But foundlings don't appear in batches of 50 or 100 at a time. And yet that's exactly what the documents describe. Mass intakes of children processed through places like the New York Foundling Hospital or the Children's Aid Society, then sent west with barely a paper trail linking them to any family or history. Some researchers point out another odd detail: How many of these children had no memory of their parents at all? Not children grieving a loss, but children who simply couldn't remember. As if something so overwhelming had erased entire sections of their early lives. So ask yourself, what happens to a society's collective memory when you remove 250,000 of its youngest witnesses? Now zoom out, because this pattern doesn't stop at America's borders. The deeper I dug, the more I found parallel programs unfolding at the same time around the world. Australia's child migration schemes, Canada's home children, British child relocation efforts, Argentina's orphanages, Russia's foundling hospitals. Different countries, same decades, the 1850s through the early 1900s. Massive numbers of children moved, reshaped, reassigned, and the paperwork is strange, full of statistics, dates, and names, yet almost empty of voices. No stories, no preserved memories. Which leads me back to the question I can't shake. How do you coordinate something like this on a global scale? In a world without instant communication, without international agencies, without the infrastructure we associate with global cooperation today? How do dozens of nations roll out nearly identical systems for managing displaced populations? Not why they did it. Not when they agreed. Not under whose authority. But how? How is that even possible? Is that kind of coordination even possible without leaving behind a clear paper trail spelling it out? Unless it wasn't coordination at all. Unless everyone was reacting to the same underlying event. I said earlier this whole investigation began with buildings, and now we circle back, because architecture has its own way of telling a story about forgetting. Walk through any major city built before 1920, and you'll see structures that don't quite fit their supposed timelines. Courthouses, train stations, libraries, exhibition halls, crafted with a level of skill and complexity that's hard to reconcile with the idea that just a few decades earlier, society was supposedly crude or barely organized. The evidence points towards something bigger. These buildings may not have been built when we're told they were. They could have been uncovered, adapted, reused, or simply renamed. But accepting that means admitting an entire civilization's worth of infrastructure was already there. And that infrastructure had to be explained, or better yet, absorbed into a story where it had always belonged to us. But buildings don't run themselves. They need caretakers. People to operate them, maintain them, give them purpose. And that's where another pattern emerges. In the late 1800s, we see the rapid rise of professional licensing and certification. Suddenly, you needed formal credentials to be an architect, a doctor, an engineer. Knowledge that once moved through experience or apprenticeship was reorganized, standardized, and tightly controlled. Old ways of knowing were boxed up and replaced. Once you notice it, it's hard to ignore the quiet erasure of one knowledge system alongside the rollout of another. Not through violence, but through paperwork, through credentials, through the steady insistence that older methods were backward, unsafe, unscientific. And who was locked out of this new system? The elderly, the traumatized, those labeled insane, children scattered into rural households, the very people who might have remembered something different. By the 1920s and 1930s, the historical record starts to smooth out. Gaps shrink. Documentation becomes cleaner. Photographs multiply. Personal accounts begin to line up neatly with official narratives. It's as if the world suddenly snaps into the timeline we recognize today. But what lingers for me is the timing. That last generation, the ones born in the 1850s and 1860s, old enough to have lived through the alleged Mudflood era, old enough to tell their grandchildren about a different world, dies off in huge numbers during World War I and the Spanish flu. Another demographic shock, another break in memory. I'm not saying those events were manufactured, but the timing matters. The efficiency with which the final living witnesses disappeared matters. The way they vanish, just as the first generation fully raised inside the new system comes of age. It's hard to ignore. The pattern repeats with an almost mechanical precision. So where did they all go? The survivors, if they existed. The people who saw whatever transition actually happened. Where are their voices? Some, I think, ended up in asylums, their memories diagnosed into irrelevance. Others were dispersed on orphan trains, their early lives wiped clean. Some likely blended in quietly, choosing silence over the risk of being dismissed as unstable or ignorant. Others died in wars and epidemics that arrived at exactly the wrong moment for history. But mostly, they went where inconvenient witnesses usually go, into silence. Not through one dramatic act of suppression, but through thousands of small pressures. Pressure to conform. Pressure to earn a living inside the new systems. Pressure from medicine to distrust their own memories. Pressure from education to abandon inherited knowledge for certified knowledge. What this points to feels larger than a simple cover-up. It looks like a full reorganization of civilization, carried out so thoroughly that within 2 generations, the previous world faded into legend. The survivors became patients, foundlings, isolated individuals with no shared voice. Their children became the first true citizens of the new order, born into a reality where the past was whatever the textbooks said it was. I started this investigation looking for people. What I kept finding instead were absences, empty spaces where voices should have been. Records that capture everything except what actually matters. Photographs that clearly show excavation, but never explain why it was happening. Buildings that seem to appear already finished, with no real construction timeline attached. Children arriving by the trainload with no clear story of where they came from. Official history tells us the late 1800s and early 1900s were an age of explosive progress. Industry booming, cities expanding, the modern world taking shape. And maybe that's all true. Maybe those ornate structures really were built in just a few years by societies still relying on horses and wagons. Maybe 250,000 children really were nothing more than street kids. Maybe the explosion of asylums truly was about humane reform. Maybe every major city genuinely needed to dig itself up again and again for routine grading. Maybe. But the questions don't go away. They stack up. They connect. They form patterns that don't fit coincidence or slow social change. Something happened. Something big enough to force a reset on a global scale. Big enough that witnesses had to be removed, memories blurred or erased, and a new version of history carefully installed. So what happened to the Mudflood? Or maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the real question is this: what does it actually take to make an entire civilization forget? How much institutionalization, relocation, credentialing, social pressure, and generational turnover would it require? How hard would it be to replace one lived history with another in the span of 50 years? The uncomfortable answer is, not very hard. You'd need asylums for those who remembered too much. Orphan trains for those who might remember later. Wars and pandemics to clear out the final living witnesses, and time. Time for the last person who knew something different to die quietly in an institution. Their memories filed away as delusion or nostalgia for a place that officially never existed. I don't have answers. Only questions that keep multiplying the further I look. Only patterns that repeat with disturbing consistency. Only gaps where something solid should be. Only silence where voices should be loud and clear. Once you notice it, you can't unsee it. And now, neither can you. Where are you watching this video from? Tell us your city or country in the comments. We'd love to see who's with us. Share your thoughts, observations, or questions. Every comment matters. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Together, we're building a community of curious explorers.